I just want to say thank you for the opportunity to come together with you and speak. This is my first time at FNF and with anything involved with CBF, but I am on the list, sir. Oh, hey, looking good, okay. So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the myth of equality and race and cultural relations in the church. And so I serve as a part of the church council at the Journey to Community Church. And so as a part of my role and as a part of the leadership of the church, we've used the book Myth of Equality, which is where this talk stems from, to engage in that initial discussion about race and cultural relations in the church. And so today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that and kind of challenge you to think about race, ethnicity, privilege, and responsibility, and how that relates to the gospel. So, my primary objectives today is to go over the overview of the basic components of the book. There are three basic parts. Explore the important concepts of social justice to help frame our mindset as you guys go into your kind of discussion sessions. And then understand our role in social justice, as well as kind of setting the groundwork for developing practical steps for action moving forward to increase God's kingdom. So with the myth of equality, again, I mentioned that there were three basic parts. And so the first part talks about the story of race. The second part is the equality and the kingdom of God. And then the third part is the challenge of privilege. And so the whole talk and the basic concept and the framework for how we're going to talk about social justice in the gospel is coming from the lens of privilege and then ultimately with responsibility. So when we think about privilege, and I've defined it here for you, it's a special right or advantage given to or immunity granted and available to a particular person or a group of people. And then the responsibility or the state or fact of having a duty to deal with something or having control over something or someone. And so this first part, we're going to talk about understanding the white standard. We're going to talk about when the world became racist and how that came to be. We're going to talk a little bit about stolen labor or slavery, and then how that plays into the way that our culture is set up. We're going to move from there into the parts 2 and 3 and kind of set the groundwork for the discussion. So first things first, I'd like to talk a little bit about the history, especially as an African-American woman who first identifies as a believer in Jesus Christ. I think, too, as an African-American woman, especially during Black History Month, let's talk a little bit about the history. So when we think about the white standard and where that comes from, so first things first, I think, initially assume that America is this melting pot of people, right? And so when we think about that, historically, we're a melting pot of people. But in the early days of the U.S., no laws existed restricting immigration up until 1790, when Congress enacted a law, and again, a law that's on the books, that allowed free white persons to become citizens. And so that language, again, is written down on the books, that only whites, American-born Africans, and those that the court ruled as white could own land and participate fully in the economy, which means that they could own land, they could vote, and so forth and so on. And so when we think about whiteness, I think what we understand it to be today is more about skin color. But from this definition and understanding where it comes from historically, it's not necessarily about skin color so much as it is about displaying characteristics of whiteness. Okay, and so when we look at this, there was no clear definition, because you could go and prove in front of a court of law that you were white and were able to own land, and because you displayed the characteristic qualities, religious practices, and beliefs, you had a certain class orientation, you made enough money, the language that you spoke was deemed okay, and you were able to intermarry, but nothing that actually had to do with actual racial grouping. So whiteness was a standard, not necessarily from skin color, but about characteristic quality. And so when we think about that, this critical concept is that because we had this white standard, which turned into white normalcy, it turned into white supremacy, leading to what we consider now today to be white privilege. Okay, so when we think about this quid pro quo of white privilege for white performance, it doesn't necessarily start as skin color. It comes from this idea of how we've defined whiteness within the country, and how you could be white as opposed to looking white. Okay. And so I think when we talk about white normalcy transforming into white supremacy, so I think it's a very easy thing. Sometimes I like to look at the media to give kind of a picture about how socially people are thinking about things. And so I've got some images of some marketing tools that they used in the 1900s, 1940s, 50s, and 60s. So if you see over there in the left-hand corner, I guess for you it's the left-hand corner, we've got Pears soap. And so in the bottom image there, if you can see, there are two toddlers, one who's using Pears soap, a white toddler and a black toddler. One who's using Pears soap to wash the other toddler who's in the tub, the black toddler in the tub. And so in the second image, you've got the white toddler being able to wash blackness, or be able to make this dark-skinned child white. And so moving from there into the 40s, we've got these mints, and I mean, again, basically innocuous things, just mints, but they were called coolies, which is a derogatory term for Japanese Americans. And so again, in the popular culture, we've taken the white standard and we've kind of started to reach into the realm of not just, okay, hitting a white standard, but now we're trying to put, I guess, moving into white supremacy, where the standard, at least in the 50s, you can see from Budweiser creating kind of this concept of what the American dream is, or what the idealized situation might be. And so in the 60s, this over here in the right, adds sparkle to your life with a lighter, clearer skin. And so again, it goes back to the concept of, you know, not just being white, so to speak, in character, but trying to be white in terms of physical attributes, which is what we consider nowadays when we talk about being white or black, as opposed to what was initially thought of as kind of white as a performance. And so when we think about race, the concept of race and racism, it's a fairly new concept of the world. And so I think the critical component to think about with this is the understanding of when it actually appears in history. So the term race, or kind of this identifying people by their race group, or a grouping of people based upon characteristic traits, these phenotypes, begins in the 1560s, but it started as a result of colonization, okay, that began in the 1400s. And so racism, or this physical characterization of people, became a way to justify the conquest and enslavement based on the subjugation of people based on, sometimes in the name of religion, but also to kind of further progress of that particular society. And so the critical concept here is the colonization split the world of humanity into different colors, because it meant something to be different, okay, from the standard. And so when we talk about this, it kind of moves into this concept of slavery, where we're talking about stolen labor. And so I always like to look at it from a historical perspective, just thinking about in terms of how tensions rise, how close it was historically to us right now. So when you think about American slavery, where we have 1619 to 1865, 246 years of labor. And so after that, we've got the Emancipation Proclamation, where slaves are now freed, but this concept of being separate but equal came into play, right? So we've got segregation, where people are now no longer allowed to be slaves, right? That's not legal. But they're still not allowed to commune in the way that we're communing now, where multiple groups of people are coming together and being one, particularly in the body of Christ. And so when we look at this, segregation lasted for 99 years. And within that, there was a period of Reconstruction where blacks were progressing post the slavery era. And as a part of that, in 1870, we've got the 15th Amendment, where again, on the books, you have black people who now have the right to vote. And so with that, there was extra reinforcement that came through the Enforcement Acts, which again protected, it allowed for the federal government to intervene if locally the governments were not enacting this particular right, specifically about black people being able to vote. Now, when we think about segregation, I feel like, and I'm also sometimes guilty of this, I think about it as such a long time ago. But it really wasn't that long ago. 54 years between 1964 and now. My parents are 64 and 65 years old. And when I think about like the Arkansas 9, who had to have police escorts going into their school building, I'm like, where did these people go? Perhaps, my parents may have experienced on a smaller level, on a local level, what these students were experiencing in Arkansas that we could see in our historical documents and videos. And so with this, here we've got progress, where blacks were given the right to vote via the 15th Amendment. But I think this quote by W.E.B. Du Bois that talks about the slave went free, stood a moment in the sun, and then moved back again towards slavery. And so when we think about slavery, yes, it's over, but there was separation. And now we're trying to repair and move forward as a country, but then also as a church. But again, it's only been 54 years. Now, this is where I think contention comes, where people have a hard time understanding experiences of other people who are different than them. This concept of black codes and Jim Crow law in the South, I think, is something that people aren't necessarily taught, and also it tends to get kind of looked over in terms of the experience of people groups within this country. And there was great progress when the Civil War was over in terms of blacks being able to vote, and that in the South you could not lawfully enslave blacks. But then you also had this rising up of Jim Crow law. Okay, and so Jim Crow law and the black codes were laws that were put into place particularly black codes, were laws that were put into place to disenfranchise and curtail the progress of blacks in that area. But Jim Crow law was an undermine of the actual, of the laws of the land, where even though the law written down said one thing, the common law about how people were treated was the opposite. So again, we talk about we're only 54 years away from segregation. And so people were being treated better, but not being treated necessarily well. And so these Jim Crow laws and the black codes were put into place to allow for the loophole of being able to, I guess, mistreat certain people groups, particularly in the South. And so when we think about that, a good example would be this concept of convict leasing. And so from 1876 to 1890, people groups, so blacks were enslaved at a higher rate, or imprisoned at a higher rate. And so ultimately with convict leasing, convicts were leased out to different people, business owners, plantation owners, from prison to work on that land and then returning back to prison for almost no pay. So even though there was no slavery, you could not legally enslave people, they were renting convicts, prisoners, to work on these same plantations of which they've been liberated from, or in locations where they had been liberated from. And so that's one example of how the law of the land said that's not right. But in commonplace, things that were trying to enact laws to prevent were still happening with a different name. And so within this, we have a certain amount of urban development that happened. And so when you think about this, as a result of those unfair practices, there was a great migration of blacks from the South to the North to try and find better opportunities. And so within that, this concept of redlining came about between the 1933 and 1936, which for a very short period of time seems like a nothing period of time, but was very divisive in terms of how we have built out our cities as of now. So when you think about that, redlining is ultimately the concept of the Homeowners Loan Corporation creating maps, okay, creating maps of the area. So like say in Worcester, we've created a map about urban areas and we've got suburban areas. And so what the Homeowners Loan Corporation did, where they created maps, outlined them in red for groups of people or people and houses that were considered high risk to give mortgages to. And so if they were considered high risk, they wouldn't be able to get a mortgage. And so most people, like I just bought a house, most people when they go out and buy a house, they're typically not buying it with cash, they're tending to get a mortgage. And so if you're in one of these high risk areas, probably you're not going to be able to get the loan to get the house to get out of the area that may not be quite as, may not give you as much access as, say, another area or a better school district somewhere else. And so they were outlined in red, and so that's where the name redlining comes from. And so that created what we call modern segregation, where you have, large groups of people of color being stuck in cities, and then you have large groups of people who are predominantly not of color living outside of these cities. And so it created its own natural separation, even though it wasn't segregation time on the books. It created a natural wealth gap between these groups of people. And so when we think about this, and we think about equality in the kingdom of God, okay? We talk about the aristocratic itch. Does justice belong in the gospel conversation? Salvation is an industrial complex, and American individualism. So when we think about this, okay, I talked about before this idealized version of the American dream, right? So we've got the American dream is a national ethos of the United States, where we have these certain ideals about liberty and opportunity, and so that everyone can be able to upwardly climb this social ladder, but very few people get to. And so you can see here I've got one image on the side where you got people climbing this social ladder, going towards the American dream, but it's crumbling, right? It's crumbling. And then also, this is just coming right from the media, the American dream, a samurai punk virtual reality trip. So when you look at this, we've got meat on the Barbie, but if you can see, you've got kind of this dichotomy about people being very happy. They've got guns, they got their dog, they're happy and smiling with this kind of mortgage and stuff, but you don't really see it right off the bat. And so you don't really see that right off the bat. And so this is kind of like, that wasn't meant to be kind of very extra. I didn't even notice it when I initially put it into the PowerPoint. But the critical concept to take away from this idea of the American dream is that very few actually achieve it, and that's by design, okay? And so this virtue connected to what we consider to be privilege. So when we think about, does justice have a place in the gospel? I'd like to read, or if someone wants to volunteer to read, Micah 6, 1 through 8. Can someone do that for me? Micah 6, 1 through 8. It's like a sword challenge.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you.
Listen to what the Lord says. Stand up, plead my case before the mountains. Let the hills hear what you have to say. Hear, you mountains, the Lord's accusation. Listen, you everlasting foundations of the earth. For the Lord has a case against his people. He is lodging a charge against Israel. My people, what have I done to you? How have I burdened you? Answer me. I brought you up out of Egypt and redeemed you from the land of slavery. I sent Moses to lead you, and also Aaron and Miriam. My people, remember what Balak king of Moab plotted, and what Balaam son of Beor answered. Remember your journey from Shittim to Gilgal, that you may know the righteous acts of the Lord. With what shall I come before the Lord and bow down before the exalted God? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000 rivers of olive oil? Shall I offer my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God.
And so in reading that, I come from an undergraduate background where faith, reason, and justice was incorporated through the curriculum. And when I think about justice and learning about the context of justice within the scriptures, in the original Greek and Hebrew text, justice and justness was synonymous with righteousness. And so in this Christian walk, when we accept kind of the new coat of salvation, we are taking off our old man and putting on our new man. And part of that is becoming this process of sanctification, becoming more Christ-like. And in that passage, it talked about all the things that God did. He did these just things to right the wrongs. And in our process, justice isn't just an option, it is necessary, right? So when we think about this critical concept, truth and justice are closely aligned and defined within the universal category, right? And so this universal category refers to the moral sphere of what ought to be, right? We are righting wrongs. We are making whole what isn't whole. And so, yes, justice is a necessary piece of the gospel, okay? And so when we think about this, I've been so blessed to be in this kind of grouping of you guys, going through and spending time together and worshiping together, because within the 1950s, 60s, and throughout, we have salvation as the industrial complex, where it was more about conversion than it was about relationship. And so in that, how we come to God stands between us. He stands between us, or Jesus stands between us and God at all times. He intercedes for our sins. And so it's not about just conversion, like a transactional understanding of salvation. But Bonhoeffer, particularly in this book, emphasized the radical defining of the gospel and the relationship. And so the critical concept here is that Jesus is ours and not just mine. And so when we can come alongside of other people who are hurting, who are struggling, who have been wronged, or receiving the residual effects of having someone else been done wrong, and now they're receiving the kind of ripple effects of that, we can come alongside those people, okay, and be our brother's keeper, okay? Fight for justice and disrupt this system of use that keeps people from being whole, right? And so Jesus is ours, not just mine. Now, within our American culture, we have this kind of intense need to be independent. The concept of American individualism, that it's my way or the highway, the raw or overriding commitment to self-preservation and self-actualization. But we're not actually made for that. We're made for community. And so we're all created in the image of God together. And so when we think about this, and we have this concept of privilege, it's not just about white privilege, which is a piece of the puzzle, but it's not just about it. It's understanding about when racism went underground, being able to think about being the voice for justice, or giving back the voice for those who have received injustice throughout history and now currently, and thinking of ourselves in other people. So treating people as we ought to, treating people as we would want to be treated, and not allowing unjust things to continue. And so as we think about this, I always like to think about getting together a baseline for how you branch into discussion and thinking about practical ways. I think the first thing we got to think about is what privileges do we have as a people group, and then thinking about how we can leverage that for the progress of God's kingdom. So we're going to do a little activity called the mathematics of life. And so as I read out these statements, what I'd like you to do is either add or subtract one, depending upon how it relates to you. So number one, add one if you're a white male. Add one if you're a white male. You can use your hands, do fist, add one if you're a white male. Subtract one if there have been times in your life when you skipped a meal because there was no food in the house. Subtract one if you have a visible or invisible disability. Add one if you attended grade school with people you felt were like yourself. Subtract one if you grew up in an urban setting. Add one if your family had health insurance. Add one if your work holidays coincide with religious holidays that you celebrate. Add one if you feel good about how your identified culture is portrayed in the media. Subtract one if you have been the victim of physical violence based on your gender, ethnicity, or age. Subtract one if you have ever felt passed over for an employment position based on your gender, ethnicity, or age. Add one if English is your first language. Subtract one if you have been divorced or impacted by divorce. Add one if you came from a supportive family environment. Add one if you have completed high school. Well, I assume you have, because you're at WPI. So add one. Add 1 if you're a citizen of the United States. Subtract 1 if you took out loans for your education. Add 1 if you attended private school. And subtract 1 if you ever felt unsafe walking alone at night. All right, so are people finding themselves at a 3? Raise your hand. If you're at a 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 or more. I don't think there's more. I think that's not how the math works. But, so what I'd like to kind of summarize with and kind of send you off into your discussion groups is the concept that privilege is a gift that shouldn't be taken as, something that creates shame in you, but it's something that should be leveraged to right the wrongs, the injustices of the past and the residual effects of the past, and we have the responsibility to do that, to create rightness or righteousness within this world. And it's a fundamental part of the gospel. And when we understand that and we can identify with other people who maybe aren't like us, who don't have the same privilege that we have, that is a testimony to the gospel of Jesus Christ, which can further his kingdom. And so my challenge to you is to take that leverage, figure out what your unique and special gifts are. Figure out who doesn't have the things that you have, and see if you can spread the gospel via interacting or working on their behalf to increase the level of access that they have, or by trying to do your best to right the wrongs that cause them to be left behind, right? So I thank you for your time and attention, and if you have questions, I'm free for questions, but you can go into your discussions. Thank you.